In the sunlit world of ancient Greece, where philosophers debated the nature of justice, poets sang of love and war, and citizens prided themselves on the birth of democracy, there existed a shadow that was both vast and deeply ingrained in daily life. Behind the marble temples, beyond the grand theaters, and hidden beneath the rhetoric of freedom and civic pride, stood one of the darkest institutions of the ancient world: slavery. For all its achievements in art, philosophy, and politics, Greece was a civilization that depended heavily on the buying and selling of human beings. And nowhere was this dependence more vividly exposed than in the bustling slave markets scattered across the Greek world. The very word slave carries with it an unsettling weight, but in ancient Greece, it was an ordinary reality. For the average free citizen walking through the agora, the sight of chained men, women, and children waiting to be sold was as common as the stalls offering olives, pottery, or woven cloth. Slave markets were not hidden or concealed. They were openly interwoven with the heart of commerce and city life. To step into one of these markets was to be confronted by a world where human dignity had a price, where bodies were inspected like livestock, and where the fate of a person could shift in the blink of an eye depending on who placed the highest bid. The origins of these slaves were as diverse as the Greek world itself. Some were prisoners of war, captured in the endless conflicts that pitted city-states against one another or Greece against foreign lands. Others were victims of piracy, snatched from coastal villages and islands, then sold far from their homes so they could never find their way back. Many were born into slavery, inheriting their parents' status as if it were a curse passed down from one generation to the next. Still others were sold into bondage by their families during times of famine or hardship, when the choice between starvation and selling a child must have seemed like no choice at all. The markets absorbed them all: warriors and peasants, artisans and children, foreigners and Greeks alike. The process of sale was chillingly pragmatic. A buyer would arrive, often accompanied by assistants, and survey the human merchandise lined up in the market square. Men were valued for their strength and stamina, their potential to work in fields, mines, or construction sites. Women were judged not only for their ability to manage households, but also, disturbingly, for their beauty, which made them vulnerable to being forced into concubinage or prostitution. Children were sold with an eye to their malleability, young enough to be molded into obedient servants, yet strong enough to grow into long years of labor. In every case, the body became a commodity, stripped of identity, reduced to its usefulness or desirability in the eyes of a buyer. To facilitate sales, slaves were often displayed with brutal frankness. In some markets, sellers would mark their foreheads with chalk to indicate skills: a cook, a weaver, a tutor. In others, they might be forced to demonstrate their talents, singing or performing tasks, while potential buyers observed. Their health was scrutinized, teeth inspected, muscles pressed, and scars noted, just as if they were beasts of burden. An older slave might be sold for a fraction of the price of a youthful one, while those with visible disabilities or injuries might fetch almost nothing at all. The dehumanization was complete, not only in the treatment of slaves, but in the very language used to describe them. In ledgers and contracts, they were listed alongside oxen and donkeys, objects of exchange with no recognition of their humanity. Yet within this grim reality, the slave market was not merely a place of buying and selling. It was a stage upon which human suffering was laid bare. Imagine the atmosphere: the cries of children separated from their mothers, the hollow eyes of men who had once been proud warriors now standing in chains, the whispered bargains of buyers calculating profit against pity. For the slaves themselves, every sound in the market carried dread. Every step of a buyer approaching could mean a new master, a new life of toil, or a descent into an even harsher fate. And for many, the hope of freedom was little more than a distant dream. kept alive only in stories of rare individuals who managed to purchase their liberty or who were freed as a reward for long service. The paradox of these markets was profound. Greece, a land that celebrated freedom as the highest virtue, that praised the independent citizen as the foundation of its political life, also sustained itself on the backs of the unfree. The democratic debates of Athens were possible in part because citizens had slaves to handle their labor, granting them the leisure to discuss philosophy or engage in politics. The art, the literature, the great architectural works that still inspire awe today, all were made possible by a system that rested on human bondage. And so, while the slave markets were physical places filled with noise and trade, they were also symbols of a deep contradiction at the heart of Greek civilization, the coexistence of freedom and slavery, of enlightenment and cruelty. Even among the Greeks themselves, this contradiction was sometimes acknowledged, though rarely challenged. Philosophers like Aristotle argued that some people were slaves by nature, destined to serve the free. His words gave intellectual justification to a system that was already deeply entrenched. And while there were voices who questioned the morality of slavery, they were faint and easily drowned out by the practical needs of a society dependent on forced labor. The markets thrived year after year, a constant reminder that even the most celebrated civilizations are capable of great darkness when it serves their interests. Once a sale was completed in the slave market, the story did not end. It merely shifted from public spectacle to private ordeal. The life that awaited a slave depended largely on who had purchased them and in which part of the Greek world they found themselves. A strong man bought by a wealthy landowner might be sent immediately to toil in the fields, plowing under the hot Mediterranean sun from dawn until dusk. Another, purchased by a silver mine operator near Lorient, would descend into narrow, suffocating tunnels where the air was thick with dust and death was a daily risk. For many, the market was only the beginning of a long descent into lives defined by exhaustion and despair. Athens, the jewel of Greece, was perhaps the most paradoxical when it came to slavery. It was the birthplace of democracy, where citizens boasted of equality under the law. Yet this equality did not extend beyond their narrow circle of male citizens. Athens was filled with slaves, purchased through its bustling markets, and their labor was everywhere. They cooked and cleaned in the homes of the wealthy, they worked as attendants for citizens attending the assembly, and they were sent to the notorious silver mines that fueled the Athenian economy. The mines were particularly infamous. Slaves were forced into deep shafts barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, carrying heavy baskets of ore to the surface. Few who entered these mines lived long lives. Many perished from collapses, poisonings, or simple exhaustion. The profits, however, were immense, allowing Athens to finance its navy and expand its cultural influence, while the suffering of those below ground remained invisible to the citizens above. In Corinth, the markets were no less cruel, though the demand often leaned toward labor connected with trade and commerce. Corinth was a hub of activity, a city where ships from across the Mediterranean arrived with goods, travelers, and, all too often, human cargo. The port's markets became infamous for the number of slaves funneled through them, many destined to serve as dock workers, transporters, or artisans forced into workshops. Women in particular faced a grim fate in Corinth. The city was known for its associations with prostitution, and many female slaves purchased in its markets were pushed into the sex trade, robbed not only of freedom but of bodily autonomy. These women were often young, selected for their appearance, and condemned to a life of exploitation that rarely offered escape. Delos, however, stood as perhaps the most chilling example of the slave trade's scale. Situated in the Cyclades, Delos became one of the greatest slave markets in the entire Mediterranean. Ancient sources suggest that at its peak, as many as 10,000 slaves could be sold in a single day on the island. The sheer volume of human trafficking conducted there is staggering to imagine. Ships would arrive loaded with captives from conquered territories, and the island became a marketplace where buyers from across Greece and beyond came to purchase men, women, and children. Delos thrived on this human misery, its prosperity built on the constant churn of lives being bought and sold. To walk through its markets was to see not just individuals, but entire groups, whole families, tribes, or villages, stripped of their freedom at once. Personal stories, though rare, offer a haunting glimpse into the individual lives behind these markets. A fragment from an Athenian speech describes a man who was once a free citizen in another city, captured during war and sold into slavery in Athens. He lamented the indignity of serving those who were once his equals, knowing that fortune alone had separated master from slave. Another account speaks of Thracian women taken as captives, paraded through Greek markets with their children, their foreign clothing and accents marking them as outsiders ripe for exploitation. These stories remind us that behind every transaction was a human being with a history, a family, and dreams that were abruptly shattered by the reality of bondage. The cruelty of the market extended beyond the moment of sale. Families were often torn apart deliberately, as buyers had no interest in preserving bonds of kinship. A mother might be sold to one household while her child was carried away by another buyer, their cries ignored in the chaos of commerce. For the Greeks, the convenience of acquiring labor outweighed any concern for the emotional devastation inflicted upon the enslaved. Ancient plays and poems occasionally allude to the grief of separation, but these laments were often stylized, written for entertainment rather than sympathy. The lived pain of those sold in the markets rarely found its way into Greek literature, which tended to focus on the perspectives of free citizens. Religion and ritual, too, intersected with the slave markets. Slaves might be offered as dedications to temples, gifted to the gods as living property meant to serve priests or perform menial tasks. In some cases, sales were accompanied by oaths sworn before deities, binding buyer and seller in sacred contract while ignoring the suffering of the human being at the center of the deal. This normalization of slavery within the sacred as well as the secular only reinforced the institution's permanence in Greek society. And yet, for all its brutality, the slave market was not always the end of hope. A small number of slaves managed to carve a path toward manumission, the granting of freedom. Some masters freed loyal servants as a reward for years of labor. Others allowed slaves to buy their own freedom, though this required extraordinary perseverance, as wages were meager and often controlled by the master. In rare cases, a slave might be freed through the intervention of a sympathetic patron or by dedicating themselves to a temple. But these were exceptions, stories told precisely because they were so uncommon. For the vast majority, the market marked the beginning of a life where freedom would remain forever out of reach. The slave markets of Greece, therefore, were not merely places of transaction. They were crucibles where human destinies were rewritten, where freedom was extinguished, and where suffering was normalized as part of everyday life. To the free citizen, they were a necessary component of economic life, an institution so embedded that to question it seemed almost unimaginable. But to the enslaved, they were the gates of a prison from which few ever escaped. And the prosperity, culture, and philosophy of Greece, so often celebrated in history, were all, in part, made possible by these markets, where the value of human life was reduced to the clinking of coins. The markets were not just commercial centers, they also shaped the psychology of both the enslaved and the free. For the slave, the experience of being bought and sold was a profound assault on the sense of self. Stripped of name, heritage, and social identity, they were forced to see themselves as their new masters saw them, property. Many slaves adopted the language of submission because survival demanded it. They learned to mask their emotions, to suppress rage or despair, and to present obedience even when their inner world was filled with grief. Yet beneath that surface compliance lay a silent resilience, the stubborn will to endure despite the constant humiliations of servitude. For the masters, meanwhile, the market offered a steady reinforcement of dominance. Purchasing another human being and commanding their labor created an illusion of natural superiority. To walk through a market and casually inspect men and women like cattle was to internalize the belief that some lives were inherently more valuable than others. The Greek citizen, proud of his freedom and political rights, often measured his own dignity in contrast to the degradation of the slave. The very identity of the free man was sharpened by this contrast. He was free precisely because another was unfree. Thus, the market was not only an economic engine, but a psychological stage on which freedom and slavery were constantly defined against each other. Philosophical voices occasionally addressed this reality, but more often with justification than with condemnation. Aristotle, in his Politics, famously described certain people as slaves by nature, destined to serve because they supposedly lacked the rational capacity for full autonomy. His words were not isolated musings. They reflected a broader cultural willingness to rationalize the institution. To Aristotle and many of his contemporaries, the market was not a place of cruelty, but of order, where the natural hierarchy of humanity was simply being expressed through commerce. It was a convenient philosophy, one that aligned neatly with the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. Other thinkers were less blunt, but equally complicit. Many of the great tragedians, for instance, wrote plays in which slaves appeared as characters, but rarely as full humans with complex inner lives. They were comic foils, loyal servants, or symbols of fate's cruelty, but seldom were they granted the dignity of true perspective. When Euripides or Sophocles mentioned the suffering of slaves, it was often in passing, a tool to heighten the drama for the free audience, rather than a call to empathy for those whose lives were daily consumed in bondage. The silences of these intellectuals are as telling as their words. They reveal a society unwilling to confront the humanity of those bought and sold in its markets. And yet, cracks sometimes appeared in this facade of justification. Certain philosophers and poets hinted, however faintly, at the injustice of slavery. The Stoics, who came later, emphasized the equality of all human beings under reason and nature, though their ideas were slow to take root. Even earlier, some voices in Greek comedy ridiculed the arrogance of masters, poking fun at their reliance on slaves for every aspect of life. These moments were rare and often cloaked in humor or abstraction, but they suggest that beneath the surface of acceptance, there was at least a flicker of awareness that something was deeply wrong. The impact of the markets extended beyond philosophy into the daily rhythms of Greek society. The presence of slaves altered the very structure of households, giving masters leisure time to participate in politics, art, and sport. Without slaves, the ideal of the free citizen devoting himself to public life would have been impossible. The agora, the heart of civic life, was filled with the labor of slaves who carried water, managed shops on behalf of their masters, and swept the streets. Even in religious festivals, slaves were present, preparing sacrifices, carrying torches, or performing menial tasks to ensure the smooth running of ceremonies. They were everywhere and yet socially invisible, acknowledged only insofar as they served a function. The contradiction became especially sharp when Greeks boasted of their love of freedom. In speeches and inscriptions, freedom was described as the highest good, the defining feature of Hellenic identity in contrast to the barbarian world. But the reality of the markets made it clear that this freedom was not universal. It was a privilege jealously guarded for a narrow class, sustained by the bondage of others. The very rhetoric of liberty in Athens gained its power because it stood in contrast to the silent suffering of those who had none. For every citizen who raised his voice in the assembly, there were countless slaves whose voices were never heard, whose stories were erased in the bustle of the markets. To grasp the scale of this contradiction, imagine a day in Athens when the assembly was in session. Citizens debated questions of war, justice, and governance, taking pride in their equal right to speak. At the same time, not far away in the market square, human beings were being sold. The laughter of politicians, the clamor of debate, the clinking of coins, and the cries of enslaved children might all mingle in the same air. Freedom and bondage, justice and injustice, reason and cruelty coexisted side by side, each reinforcing the other in a society that never fully acknowledged the paradox. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to imagine that the Greeks must have seen the hypocrisy, that they must have recognized the injustice of slavery. But the power of the markets lay precisely in their ability to normalize. The buying and selling of humans was so deeply woven into daily life that it became invisible to those who benefited from it. To question it would have required dismantling the very foundations of Greek society, its economy, its politics, its culture. And so the markets continued, humming with commerce, feeding the wealth of the cities, and leaving behind only faint echoes of the human suffering that was their true currency. If the slave markets were the stage upon which human misery was displayed, then war was the inexhaustible supplier that kept them filled. The connection between conquest and slavery in ancient Greece was absolute. Each military campaign, each clash between rival city-states, and each expansion against foreign peoples brought with it not only plunder of gold and land, but also the capture of human lives. Prisoners of war were the most valuable spoils, for they could be marched back to Greece and sold in the markets, turning battlefield victories into long-term economic gains. In this way, warfare and slavery were bound together in a cycle that seemed unbreakable. War created slaves, and slaves fueled the society that could wage further wars. The Greeks themselves made no secret of this practice. Accounts of battles often describe not just the clash of armies, but the aftermath, the sacking of towns, the rounding up of survivors, and their subsequent sale. The Peloponnesian War, which ravaged Greece for decades, produced a constant stream of captives. Entire cities that resisted were sometimes enslaved in their entirety, their men slaughtered, and their women and children dragged into markets to be sold. The destruction of Melos by Athens in 416 BCE is perhaps the most infamous example. After besieging the island, the Athenians executed the adult men and sold the women and children into slavery. It was a brutal reminder that even the most celebrated democracy of the ancient world was capable of atrocities when it served political and economic goals. Nor was Athens alone in this. Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes all participated in the same cycle of conquest and enslavement. When Greek city-states turned their swords outward, conquering territories across the Aegean or Asia Minor, the flow of captives grew even larger. Each war was an opportunity to replenish the markets, to provide merchants with new bodies to sell, and to feed the insatiable demand for labor. It is telling that the Greeks often viewed foreign peoples, Thracians, Scythians, Persians, as natural sources of slaves, their cultural otherness used as justification for their subjugation. To be a non-Greek in the wrong place at the wrong time was to risk being caught in this machinery of human trade. The scale of these enslavements was staggering. Ancient sources describe ships loaded with hundreds of captives sailing directly from war zones to places like Delos, where they could be sold in bulk. Merchants followed armies like vultures, ready to profit from the defeated. In some cases, commanders themselves oversaw the sale of captives, ensuring that the spoils of war were converted into wealth for the polis or for their own coffers. For the victims, there was no recourse, no appeal to mercy. A soldier captured in battle might once have stood proudly in defense of his homeland, but in the market, he was just another commodity. His armor stripped away, his body displayed for inspection. The impact on conquered communities was devastating. Families were not merely broken, they were obliterated. A mother might see her husband cut down before being chained and sold alongside her children. A city that had once thrived with its own culture and traditions could be emptied of its population in a single campaign, its people dispersed across the Greek world as slaves. These cultural erasures were part of the silent cost of the markets. While Greek civilization flourished, entire peoples vanished into bondage, their voices silenced, their identities dissolved into the anonymity of servitude. The Greek playwright Euripides, in one of his tragedies, gave voice to Trojan women, lamenting their fate after the fall of Troy. Mothers separated from daughters, queens reduced to slaves, children taken from their families. While this was presented as art, a mythological retelling of Homer's epic, it also reflected a grim reality familiar to every Greek audience. They knew that war produced captives, and that captives were destined for the market. The tears of Trojan women on the stage echoed the cries of countless real women who were being sold in places like Corinth and Delos. In this way, art and life converged, each reminding the other of the human cost that lay behind the grandeur of conquest. Even piracy, which haunted the Mediterranean seas, fed the slave markets. Bands of raiders prowled the coasts, seizing fishermen, farmers, or travelers, then selling them to Greek merchants. These victims were often indistinguishable from war captives, and for the markets, it made little difference how they had been acquired. The effect was to turn the entire Mediterranean into a hunting ground, where no one was entirely safe from the threat of enslavement. A voyage gone wrong, a village left undefended, a sudden raid in the night, any of these could end in chains on the auction block. For the Greeks, the integration of war and slavery was so complete that it shaped their worldview. To be victorious in battle was to gain not just honor, but wealth, measured in the human beings who could be sold. To be defeated was to risk annihilation, not just as a soldier, but as a community. This constant threat gave Greek warfare an added layer of brutality, for the consequences of losing were not merely territorial, but existential. The market awaited the vanquished, indifferent to their courage or suffering. Thus, the slave markets were not isolated phenomena, but part of a vast network of violence, commerce, and power. They stood at the crossroads of war and economy, turning the tragedies of conquest into opportunities for profit. Every coin exchanged in these markets was stained with the memory of a battlefield, every purchase the final act of a story that began with fire and blood. To understand the Greek slave markets is to see not only the commerce of cities, but the destruction of lives, the way war and greed conspired to create a system that consumed generation after generation. Among the most haunting aspects of the Greek slave markets was the treatment of children. Their presence in these bustling centers of commerce revealed the full extent of cruelty embedded in the system. For merchants and buyers, children were seen as investments, cheaper to purchase than adults, yet capable of yielding decades of labor if they survived. They were pliable, easily molded into the roles their masters required, whether as domestic servants, field workers, or future concubines. But for the children themselves, the market was often their first encounter with a world that had stripped them of parents, home, and security. Imagine the terror of a child, barely old enough to understand the meaning of chains, suddenly thrust onto an auction block while strangers examined them with calculating eyes. The separation of families was not incidental but deliberate. Merchants often broke families apart to maximize profit, selling children individually rather than with their mothers. A small boy might be sold to a farmer, a girl to a wealthy household, and their mother to a mine or a workshop. This fragmentation ensured that bonds of kinship would not interfere with obedience. For the Greeks, sentiment was a luxury. Efficiency and profit dictated the terms of the market. The cries of children torn from their parents were simply part of the background noise of commerce, muffled beneath the chatter of bargaining and the clink of coin. Once purchased, children entered a harsh process of breaking in. Young boys were trained to obey commands without hesitation, their natural playfulness suppressed under the threat of punishment. In workshops, they were set to menial tasks, fetching water, carrying tools, or tending fires, before being trained in crafts. Some were taught to become skilled artisans, blacksmiths or potters, not for their own benefit but to enrich their masters. Girls, meanwhile, were often trained in domestic service, weaving, cooking, and managing household chores. The most beautiful or healthy among them risked an even darker fate, being raised with the expectation of sexual exploitation once they reached maturity. The market was ruthless in its ability to anticipate and assign the roles that these young lives would fill. The process of branding and marking was another cruelty that exposed the raw dehumanization of slavery. In some cases, slaves, both children and adults, were tattooed or branded with hot irons to mark ownership. These marks might indicate the household to which they belonged or serve as permanent reminders of their status. To carry such a scar was to bear a visible sign of subjugation, stripping away individuality and replacing it with a symbol of control. Ancient comedies occasionally made reference to these marks, often as jokes, but behind the humor lay the grim reality of pain and humiliation. For the enslaved, their very bodies were claimed as property, their skin transformed into a ledger of ownership. Punishment played a central role in the discipline of slaves purchased in the markets. Buyers were well aware that human beings did not naturally submit to bondage, and so they relied on fear to maintain control. Whippings, beatings, and even mutilations were recorded as methods of enforcing obedience. Some masters fitted runaway slaves with heavy wooden collars inscribed with warnings like, "Catch me if I run." These collars were not only instruments of restraint, but of shame, advertising the slave's desperation to reclaim freedom. Children, too, were not spared from such punishments, though their smaller frames often made the brutality even more devastating. Despite this cruelty, Greek society wrapped the institution in layers of justification that made it appear natural, even necessary. Everyday language reflected this normalization. In Greek households, the word doulos, slave, was as common as oiketes, household member, making no distinction between property and person. Legal contracts treated slaves as movable assets, listed alongside tools and livestock. Even in literature, when slaves were given voices, they were often portrayed as clever tricksters or loyal servants, roles that reinforced their marginality rather than questioned the system itself. The markets provided the fuel for this language, constantly replenishing households with new lives to be shaped into these archetypes. The visibility of slave markets also reinforced their acceptance. Citizens could not walk through an agora without encountering the sight of slaves lined up for sale, their presence a constant reminder of the division between free and unfree. For a young Greek boy growing up in such an environment, the market taught lessons as powerful as any school: that freedom was a privilege, that power could be bought, and that human life could be measured in coin. This early exposure ensured that each new generation absorbed the logic of slavery without question, perpetuating the cycle indefinitely. Yet even in this environment of normalization, the humanity of the enslaved occasionally broke through. Anecdotes survive of children who clung desperately to their mothers in the market, refusing to let go until pried apart by force. Others resisted by running away, hiding in crowds, or attempting to sabotage their own sale by feigning illness. These acts of defiance, though small, remind us that the markets were not merely places of commerce, but of constant struggle. Behind every sale was a battle of wills, the buyers seeking to impose ownership, and the enslaved, however powerless, striving to retain some fragment of dignity or hope. The plight of children in the Greek slave markets is perhaps the clearest window into the cruelty of the system. For adults, slavery meant the loss of freedom, of status, of identity. For children, it meant the loss of everything before life had even begun. They were denied not only liberty, but the very chance to grow within the safety of family and community. Their laughter, their innocence, their futures, all were swallowed by the cold machinery of commerce. Instead, it turned their suffering into profit, their vulnerability into opportunity. Once the slave had been purchased and taken from the market, their life became woven into the daily fabric of Greek society. Yet the experience of bondage did not look the same for everyone. Much depended on the type of work assigned, the temperament of the master, and the environment into which the slave was placed. In every case, however, the essential truth remained. They were property, stripped of autonomy, their lives directed not by their own will, but by the whims of another. Domestic slaves were perhaps the most visible in Greek households. They were often tasked with cooking, cleaning, fetching water, and attending to the daily needs of their masters. Some were personal attendants who accompanied citizens to public events, carrying their cloaks or preparing their baths. Others were assigned to children, serving as tutors or nannies, a role that produced a strange intimacy. It was not uncommon for Greek children to grow up closer to the slaves who raised them than to their own parents. Yet even in this closeness, the boundary of ownership was never forgotten. The same child who called a slave nurse or teacher was also taught that this person was not free, that their loyalty was expected, not chosen. Agricultural slaves, on the other hand, lived harder and more isolated lives. Purchased in bulk from the markets, they were often sent to farms and estates in the countryside. Here they plowed fields, tended flocks, and harvested crops under constant supervision. The work was grueling, the hours long, and punishments harsh. Because these slaves were far from the public eye, the conditions could be brutal without consequence. Some masters lived in the city and rarely visited their estates, leaving overseers in charge of enforcing discipline. For the slaves, this meant that cruelty could go unchecked. Whippings, beatings, and even killings went unpunished, for in the eyes of the law, they were not crimes but the exercise of property rights. Perhaps the most infamous category of slave labor was found in the mines. The silver mines at Laurion near Athens were notorious across the ancient world. Here, slaves were sent into dark, narrow shafts where they hacked at stone by lamplight, breathing in toxic dust and enduring suffocating heat. Many were children, their small bodies more suited to crawling through the tight spaces. Life expectancy in the mines was shockingly short. Slaves there were treated as expendable, worked until they collapsed, then replaced with new bodies bought cheaply in the markets. The wealth that financed Athens' democracy, its navy, and its grand building projects, the Parthenon itself, was in no small part extracted through this horrific exploitation. Citizens celebrated their freedom in assemblies above ground, while beneath the earth, thousands of slaves labored invisibly, their lives consumed for the sake of civic glory. Industrial slaves worked in workshops and manufactories. These slaves produced pottery, textiles, metal goods, and countless other items that filled Greek markets. Some masters entrusted skilled slaves to manage entire workshops, overseeing production and even handling finances. In rare cases, such slaves could earn small allowances, sometimes saving toward the hope of purchasing freedom. But even the most skilled artisan remained bound, their profits flowing to their master rather than to themselves. Their expertise was a double-edged sword. It gave them a measure of security, but also made them too valuable to be freed. The intimacy of domestic slavery created peculiar contradictions. A slave might know their master's secrets, overhear private conversations, or witness family disputes. They could be confidants and caretakers, yet always under suspicion. Trust was given, but never fully. Many households feared the loyalty of their slaves, worried they might betray confidences or attempt escape. As a result, even the most trusted servants lived under constant surveillance. They were indispensable and yet distrusted, essential and yet disposable. Sexual exploitation was another grim reality, particularly for female slaves. Purchased in the markets, many were destined for concubinage or prostitution. In wealthy households, female slaves could be forced into relationships with their masters or with visiting guests. In brothels, they were sold not once but endlessly, their bodies commodified again and again. This dimension of slavery was rarely acknowledged openly in public discourse, but it was an open secret in Greek society. Plays and comedies sometimes joked about it, normalizing what was, in truth, a profound violation of human dignity. Greek law reflected the contradictions of these relationships. Slaves were denied political rights, could not own property independently, and were subject to their master's will. Yet paradoxically, they were sometimes entrusted with significant responsibilities, managing money, teaching children, or even representing their masters in business. This uneasy balance highlighted the core hypocrisy of Greek slavery. The society recognized the intelligence and capability of slaves while simultaneously denying their humanity. The market supplied not only brute laborers, but also educated captives, scribes, and teachers, further blurring the line between tool and person. The presence of slaves in nearly every corner of Greek life meant that their suffering was simultaneously visible and invisible. Everyone saw slaves in the streets, in homes, in temples, and in fields, yet their pain was rarely acknowledged, their voices rarely heard. They were part of the landscape, as ordinary as the stones of the agora or the columns of the temples. The slave market was the starting point, but the real tragedy unfolded in the daily grind of existence that followed, in the countless unseen moments where a person's will was crushed under another's command. This dual reality, closeness and distance, reliance and denial, defined the Greek relationship with slavery. Citizens lived alongside the enslaved, benefited from their labor, even shared their households with them. But the barrier of ownership remained an unyielding wall, reinforced by the memory of the markets where these relationships began. No matter how familiar a slave became, they could never escape the fact that they were, in the eyes of society, property first and human second. In the centuries that followed the classical period, the shadow of slavery did not recede, but instead adapted to the shifting fortunes of Greek states. The rise of Macedonia under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great brought enormous upheaval to the Mediterranean world, and with it, an unprecedented movement of peoples. As Alexander's armies swept through Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, and as far east as India, prisoners of war were taken in staggering numbers. Entire populations could be uprooted in a single campaign, and slave markets swelled with men, women, and children from conquered lands. The once modest slave markets of cities like Athens or Corinth now stood alongside sprawling depots in Asia Minor and Egypt, where the spoils of conquest were displayed like trophies of imperial ambition. The great military successes that Greeks so often celebrated in poetry and song were, for the enslaved, the beginning of endless suffering. Alexander's conquests also created new centers of commerce where the slave trade flourished with even greater intensity. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became hubs not only of culture and learning, but also of commerce in human lives. Slaves from Greece were shipped outwards to foreign lands, while captives from Asia and Africa poured into the Greek-speaking world. This intermingling of populations blurred ethnic lines within the slave markets, making the trade seem almost cosmopolitan, though in reality it was rooted in misery and exploitation. The image of bustling harbor cities filled with ships unloading goods from across the known world carried a darker undertone. Among the cargo were human beings stripped of all dignity and reduced to commodities in a system that seemed impossible to stop. In these bustling cities, the presence of slavery became normalized to an astonishing degree. The educated elites who gathered in the libraries of Alexandria or debated in public forums rarely questioned the foundation upon which their intellectual pursuits rested. The existence of vast numbers of slaves provided the labor necessary for construction, farming, and domestic work, enabling the free citizens to devote themselves to politics, philosophy, and the arts. A visitor walking through a Greek city in the Hellenistic age might pass by opulent houses, hear poets reciting verses, and see monuments celebrating victory, all while slaves silently carried burdens, swept courtyards, and served wine at symposia. The brilliance of the age was inseparable from the shadows that sustained it. Yet, even within this normalized system, occasional cracks appeared in the facade of acceptance. In times of war or political upheaval, slaves sometimes attempted to seize their freedom. The sheer number of enslaved people in certain regions made uprisings a constant fear for the ruling class. Rumors of revolts spread easily, and even minor disturbances could spark panic among citizens who relied so heavily on their labor. The stories of runaway slaves, desperate individuals who sought refuge in the mountains or attempted to blend in with free populations, were reminders that beneath the surface of compliance lay a deep yearning for liberty. Slave markets, while orderly in appearance, carried this underlying tension. The knowledge that every person sold or purchased carried within them the possibility of rebellion. Greek philosophers of the Hellenistic period, though inheritors of earlier thought, did little to fundamentally alter the moral framework of slavery. The Stoics, for example, spoke of the brotherhood of mankind and the importance of virtue over external conditions, yet they did not advocate for the abolition of slavery. Instead, they suggested that a wise man could be free even in chains, and that true slavery was ignorance, not bondage. This offered comfort to some, perhaps, but it did not challenge the material conditions of the countless men and women bought and sold in the markets. The reality of chains, labor, and separation from family could not be softened by philosophy alone. For many, the ideals of freedom and equality spoken in abstract terms seemed like distant stars, visible but unattainable. By the time Rome began to dominate the Greek world in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Greek slave system had already left an indelible mark on the Mediterranean. The Romans, inheriting Greek culture, also absorbed its practices of slavery, expanding them to an even larger scale. The slave markets of Greece did not vanish, but were integrated into a wider Roman economy, where demand for slaves was insatiable. The Greek cities, once the proud centers of trade and philosophy, became part of a greater network in which human beings were trafficked across seas and borders with ruthless efficiency. For the enslaved, the shift from Greek to Roman masters brought little relief. The chains remained, only the accents of their oppressors changed. As the curtain began to fall on Greek political independence, what remained was the paradox that had haunted the civilization for centuries. This was a culture that gave the world democracy, philosophy, and art of unparalleled beauty, yet it also perfected the machinery of human bondage. The markets that once rang with the voices of auctioneers and the cries of the enslaved eventually grew quieter, some absorbed into the Roman system, others fading as cities declined. But their memory endured, carried in the accounts of historians and travelers, preserved in fragments of law and literature. To walk through the ruins of these ancient cities today is to imagine the invisible presence of those countless souls, their lives bought and sold on stone streets where philosophers once mused about the nature of freedom. The shadows of the slave markets linger still, a reminder that even the brightest achievements of civilization are often built on foundations of suffering.